I'd like to begin my comments here by making an observation about the modeling process, and particularly about this stage of model conceptualization. It may serve as a singular irony to many of those in the room that it's this first stage which is the hardest. We have in this room and in the foyer outside some students who collectively have an amazing group history of contributing to models. Many of them are exquisitely good at helping to build up models, to working to align them with data, etc., to incorporate new data into them using very advanced mechanisms. But only a few I would ask to take on this first stage here. You want to do so, if not as an apprentice, at least with close consultation with those who have been in the modeling domain for a long time. Because there will be dragons in that first stage. And it's really tricky to get that right balance between simplicity of and sort of clarity of first articulation and meaningfulness of the results and its addressing of research questions. This is an issue we struggle with, and I've never found a fully adequate kind of class or set of lectures that deal with it. This is one, for example, that Kurt in the back there has recently really learned to take on to a level of virtuosity, and he approaches graduation as a result. Others remain yet in the incubator, but are coming along well. So for this first stage, it's the most fragile, and it's the one where you most need consultation. I'd like to engage in some thinking about this, and to this end, I have provided you with a set of resources for on the website. Okay, and if we go to this material, the participant resources, you'll find that there's a folder called Support Materials for Model Conceptualization. Okay, and within this, there's a set of documents, and these are designed to probe different types of considerations and to provide some further background. I'm going to talk through some of this, but many of them are designed more as sort of reference points. As an example of this, you'll notice there's one called Hallmarks of Complex Systems. This provides that kind of glimpse of that slide that was part of my initial presentation this morning, the presentation on motivations for system science, the sort of things that alert us to the need for system science. Because we find quite a few students come to some of our events with a problem that they'd like to take on without a clear understanding about why it's a dynamic modeling problem. Like, where does dynamic modeling fit in there? And it bears noting that dynamic modeling is not for everything. There's lots of situations where I will go use a recurrent events analysis or a survival analysis, or I'll go conduct, work with a Bayesian inference model, or I'll go use machine learning. I'll go do a logistic regression instead of using a complex systems tool like dynamic modeling. It has very particular needs associated with it. It has very particular circumstances in which we use it. And the circumstances, ladies and gentlemen, have to do with these systems where the whole is greater than the sum of the parts. And these are some features that hint to us, that whisper to us that a situation is such that the whole is greater than the sum of the parts. Much of it has to do with feedbacks. We see feedbacks in a system where for example, it leads the system to be resistant to change. It's difficult to change the system because of the regulatory natures. Weight is an example of that. If we try to lose weight, our metabolism slows down, and our loss of weight is less than we would have anticipated. But there's many systems like that in the world, organizationally, for example. They discourage innovation, that lead to inertia. Is that not so, Jeff? We have situations of path dependence where an early factor leads to very different outcomes far down the road. We can't simply look at that factor being an explanatory variable in the current time to some other outcome. Rather, we need to, the system has some memory of this from early on. And path dependence is a pronounced feature of many systems involving early life exposures, for example, and later outcomes. We know from the work of Barker and others in the Manchester context that these early life exposures in the first 5 years can seem to be associated with very large vulnerabilities later in life to chronic disease, for example. We have effects of local environment and localized perception that affect outcomes. So, a driver of a car, we want to understand traffic jams. It has a lot to do with what a given car can see and not. I remember I used to live, during my first health policy modeling work, I lived in the bustling confines of the LA area. And I remember that there used to be traffic jams that would reliably occur at certain roads because that's where the curves were, and the people couldn't see ahead of them. And you've got 10 lanes all going in the same direction at high speeds, and people slow down, and it leads to this kind of, bunching effect that leads to artificial traffic jams. I remember a friend calling me from one at midnight saying, "Oh, there's a traffic jam on the 405, certain location." It's unbelievable. So localized perception, trying to understand how does that lead to the dynamics we see is often an attractive component. Where you have different effects at different scales, the family level, the individual level, the classroom level, or school level, etc. And entanglements of processes at that scale. So school-related processes entangled with individual level backgrounds, etc. We have network effects, network formation, dissolution, spread of things over network, like the Christakis and Fowler diagram on obesity in a network. I've done heterogeneity, but it's not to be taken at face value that things are different out there. There's not just one size of person or shape of the type of vaccine or something. It's not just heterogeneity. It's heterogeneity that has disproportionate impact. Where a small subgroup, for example, distinguished by some characteristics, has a huge impact that's posited in keeping gonorrhea alive in our province as a circulating bug. That if the situation were different, if it were just the average person in terms of if we just averaged over it, we would think gonorrhea would disappear, but it actually is kept alive by certain core groups of individuals. A small segment of the population, but very important for disease epidemiology. We're dealing with dynamics, change over time. There can be pronounced delays, which we need to account for, and outcomes, perhaps associated with path dependence. There's individual decision making that is very important based on their particular context, adaptation or learning, non-linearities, situation where there's threshold effects, sudden changes. Ross Hammond tells the story of carnitine, this element which is found, this substance found in red meats, which was widely believed to be fairly dangerous in sort of an increasing dose-response relationship. And what they found is that actually there were big thresholds associated with exposure to it that would pose risks. But below that, it doesn't just rise linearly, the risk. It's quite sort of, has a big threshold effect that if you're below that, it's comparatively safe. Above that, it's comparatively dangerous. And then interagent effects. So these are hallmarks of complex systems that are things we look for with a lot of models as suggesting if those are important to our research questions, if these have big impacts on the sort of phenomena we're interested in, if they're posited to have a big role, then complex systems modeling is very likely to be indicated. Okay, very likely to be recommended. Okay, I've also provided here some comments on ABM conceptualization, and this says ABM, but it's much of it really relates to complex systems modeling more generally. And I'm actually, just to have it handy, I'm going to download it here and open it up. Here. So, some comments on sort of this first stage here. I noted earlier that the key role of identification of a question, of a certain question. We noted this truism posited by George Boggs: all models have implications, therefore wrong, but some models are useful. Models are useful as learning tools, but establishing a clear model purpose is critical for defining what is included in model and what is not. The ways in which we make it wrong and the ways in which we keep it grounded. Now, with agent-based models, and since this bootcamp is entitled Agent-Based and Hybrid Modeling, there's a particular emphasis on this. With agent-based models, the flexibility and generality of the ABM supports fairly ready creation of very, very rich models. And it's very easy to add lots of detail to these models. And it's one of the mistakes beginners make most readily. They realize, oh, I can add that in. Oh, I can add that in. You know, I'm working with a logistic regression model results that has 10 different explanatory variables. All of them go in as attributes of agents. You know, so we'll have agents defined by income and by education and by sex and by ethnic category and urban, rural, and you get agents just chock-a-block full of properties. Can you do it? Sure, you can do it. Is that likely to be an insightful model in the short term? Not likely. It may be that ultimately your model will have those pieces, but you want to build it up step by step to that for many reasons we'll talk about. And because of the flexibility of these sorts of models, there's a particular need to be parsimonious, to be clear and disciplined, ladies and gentlemen, about model scope. Okay. Here, there's a few general principles I like to use. Okay. If you add something in, it doesn't mean you'll get more out. Often there's an opportunity cost. You add it in, there's something else you can't look at. Takes your time away from something because you have limited time. When you're adding in that extra parameter, there's a hidden cost to it. You're not adding in more of your time, and so it's going to take away from something. And often it takes away from more savvy exploration. And it's better to start without the parameter, explore, learn from the model, then you can put something in that's much more savvy. So John Sturman at MIT talks about model purpose serving as a logical knife to cut away extra complexity. And there's a principle we use in software engineering called the Yagni principle. You ain't gonna need it. And basically that says, look, unless you are absolutely convinced this is needed in the immediate term because you believe it's the highest priority, start simple, add only once you've explored a simpler model. And most importantly, incremental model development. Build up your model in pieces. So I've alluded to this, but I'd like to comment about it more. We build models in this boot camp, and you are advised to build models outside of this boot camp in a step-by-step fashion. With each iteration, the model is modified in a small fashion to add something in. And each new version is, we say, docked against, meaning it's compared to the earlier version of the model. If the new feature that I've added in is turned off, do I get the same results as the old version? That's a good sanity check. What new behavior did this new version add that I didn't see in that older model? We sort of constantly compare to the older version so that we can learn from the newer version. What did it bring to the table? Is it possible there's a bug in the newer version and we've broken something in the old version? What this new thing we represented, what new dynamics has it caused? These are things we try to learn from by either directly or by memory comparing against the immediate older version. And these incremental versions can be demonstrated to stakeholders and can often produce insight. And really this is the most important aspect of it in my view is we can learn from the model as we build it. Ladies and gentlemen, models are not something you anticipate just go build and run as a crystal ball. I argued this morning that models are learning tools. They are learning prostheses. And as such, the modeling is a learning process. And we want to dignify what we've learned by putting it into place in terms of prioritizing what we do next. Often, a model with just a few features in it we learn something from so we can choose the next step in a more savvy way. So perhaps we anticipated 2 years hence, we'll have a rich model. If you just build that model directly, you don't run it along the way, and you sort of work assiduously to get in place all the data, all the pieces, you may end up with a quite rich model. But you'll have a difficult time, a devil of a time, in fact, figuring out what is contributing to what. There's so many moving parts. There's so many things that are going on here. How do I know what's contributing to this interesting behavior? At the least, it will take a large amount of exploration. And chances are, you may find a lot of bugs in the process, a lot of mistakes, a lot of mistaken implementation. Thing you wanted to do, but you expressed it in the wrong way, and when you created it. And so a lot of interesting features you see in results may initially be artifactual, because they're aspects of model implementation problems. Other aspects may be interesting emergent phenomenon, but it's teasing out what's contributing to it is hard. So building that model 2 years from now, working towards it, what I'd call the big bang type of modeling, you're leaving a lot of money on the table. There's a lot of opportunities for learning that you're sacrificing, and a lot of opportunities for having a much more savvy model. So what I recommend is building it up piece by piece along the way, where each next piece has been informed not just by stakeholder needs or priorities, but the learning that's gone on. And 2 years from now, you may have a very rich, powerful model, but you've done many things along the way to take advantage of that time. You've enhanced stakeholder confidence because you're showing them the model all along the way. Improve morale from the modeler. You can cut off the model development at any time. Jeff's colleague, Mark Heffernan, talks about having always a model running so that if you're not going to be able to go any further, you have something to show for it. It's not, well, in 6 more months we'll have something to show. You have greater clarity prioritization because you've been learning for it along the way, and you've been able to change the direction based on learning. You can secure feedback from stakeholders that you wouldn't have secured otherwise. But remember, running it in front of them, showing them the patterns coming from it, having them interact with the model often elicits this tacit knowledge. And you can capture that and learn from it along the way so that it's a more savvy model. Because you're only modifying one thing at each step along the way, it's faster to diagnose bugs. If there's a problem, you notice it sooner, you notice it at that step or the next step, and there's only a few things you've changed, so it's easy to track down where it came from. And very, very importantly, if we see interesting patterns coming out of the model, unexpected findings, we know where they came from, what had the biggest impact and what not, and what has comparatively small impact. Which things, when we added them, made a qualitative difference, which things were just a matter of tweak and degree. So there's a couple key questions that I'd like to suggest for selecting the method, the the model boundary, and indeed something about the methodologies to be used. And I provided you some guidelines there as well. We'll come to. These were contributed as part of a course that I co-taught with Elizabeth Brew last month. Yeah. And Kurt was also an important component of that course. So these are some questions you might want to ask. What are the features of the policy environment or state of knowledge in the field? For example, at what level do we need to characterize the system to capture impacts of interventions or policies you're interested in investigating, if indeed you're interested in investigating such? Do we have to characterize it at an individual level, or more aggregate, higher level characterization is acceptable? Would it be suitable? Is there data available for informing things at a particular level of analysis, at an individual level? Is there that understanding of behavior, or some guiding theory that can inform it? If there's not, could this be a model for theory building rather than theory explication? You know, exploring an existing theory versus working to contribute to build up what might be going on in terms of the individual behaviors. Is there a potential disconnect between theory and available data? Is theory articulated at an individual level and data is only available at an aggregate level? If so, you might want to proceed cautiously and think about, again, theory building that could explain the available data. Is heterogeneity critical to represent a given process? And at what level are stakeholders thinking about the issues? Jeff talks about how system dynamics models of, say, a clinical context sometimes fall afoul of the tendency for doctors, the preference of doctors to think about things at an individual level. He talks about how doctors are very used to thinking about clinical encounters at the level of particular patients. And when they see a stock of patients, they know it represents some count of patients, but for many doctors, that's hard to relate to. Okay. When we have a given version of a model, a specific sort of iteration of a model, we will often distinguish between three ways in which we capture things in the model. I mentioned this earlier, but I'm bringing it around again because it's going to be an important part of the exercise I'm going to give to you in a short period of time here. One is, we ask, what are we looking for the model to give us? What are we looking for it to produce? What things are part of its generative process, its producing them? Which things are exogenous? We're specifying to the model in a pre-specified way. Maybe they're time series or constants. We say, let the employment rate change like this. We're going to posit a growing unemployment rate followed by a period of sort of fixed rates. Or maybe we're going to impose certain constant assumptions on certain aspects of the model, interest rates or on the food environment or what have you. What things are we imposing? That model this morning, we imposed, that very first model, we imposed some things on that model. The model didn't generate it, rather we imposed it. What would be some examples of things that were exogenous in that first model? Can anyone come? What things do we tell the model, assume this, and it was incorporated into the model dynamics? The model considered it, but it was in a fixed way. Give me some examples. That very first model. What's fixed here? What things are given? Distances. Good. Distances from homes to parks. In fact, the location of all these parks. More than that, the location of these supermarkets and of the convenience stores. This is all fixed. It's all specified to the model. We said, let it be. And it was. So that's all part of it. In fact, the whole routing, the whole GIS context, we said, assume this. We didn't have agents rerouting, moving their home on a trailer to a new area. We didn't have them altering the location of parks, building new parks, or changing the location of supermarkets to reflect demand. Winchell, who was, I believe, not currently in the room, but his spirit pervades us even yet. He's built models where you'll actually have store dynamics, and what a store stocks depends on the demand for fresh fruits and vegetables within the store. This is work in conjunction with the WIC program. And Iden, who I believe is in the room and just entered it, is materially advanced that model in recent weeks. So those would be examples of a situation where what a store stocks is dynamic. Here, the stores, convenience stores, you get convenience store meals. Pizza pops and hot dogs and corn dogs and floaters and screaming yellow zonkers and what else, Jeff? Meat pies. Meat pies. And even in the Australian context, Hostess Twinkies have penetrated. Yes. So these things are fixed in this model, and certainly supermarkets only offer, somewhat more healthy fare. That's all fixed. What else is fixed in this model? What else is a given within this context? What else do we lend to people, for example, to individuals, that's a feature of their condition and they cannot modify it? Well, it turns out their preference for convenience store meals. Ross Hammond has a nice model. Anyone who's interested in obesity research should refer to Ross Hammond's model on temporal difference learning. Kurt can provide you a reference to that. Within that model is a stylized model, as many agent-based models are. It's a simple model of agents. They wander in a zombie-like fashion through fields of foods. So they wander through foods that are scattered variously as broccoli or chocolate cake. And they consume the foods around them. But critically, they form their food preferences from the fields of origin. So they walk through the fields. In the first few years, I think they develop their preferences. So if they were surrounded in their earliest years by fields of broccoli, they develop a predilection for the green stalks. If they started their wanderings in fields of chocolate cake, they have a sweet tooth that persists through life. And over time, they acquire some changes in preference, but they're affected by their food environment. Here, we simply impose a preference for convenience store meals on an agent. So that's exogenous. We impose some distribution on the agents of preferences, and that's not evolving over time, according with the agents. A given agent has a fixed preference, and their location, in fact, their home, is fixed. That's pre-specified to them. It's a parameter. It's an assumption. We use it. And they go through life with the same domicile and the same preference for floaters and screaming yellow zonkers. What things are endogenous here? What things evolve for an agent? What things are being modified? What thing is the model producing? Yeah, their weight is changing. Their weight is adjusting, and that's the biggest outcome of interest. There's some other aspects of their state which are actually evolving as well as part of the things that contribute to weight. Does anyone remember seeing us looking at the dietary habits of one such individual? What was the thing that was being modified? It was over here on the left-hand side. Anyone remember this?
They were counting the types of meals.
Yeah, the types of meals they have in their larder. How many supermarket meals do they have? How many convenience store meals? And we actually keep track of how many they've eaten at a historical level. So this is an example of things that are that are endogenous in the system, they're the particular aspects of what they're eating is endogenous. We're not pre-specifying that in a direct way. It's resulting from a complex interplay. And over time, we could actually do things. There's a version of this model, which I believe is not here. Alex could remind us. But there's a version of this, which if people wanted to do, we could do it. I mean, we don't want to do that hard. Where we can add supermarkets. Or we can click. And there we populate supermarkets in the food deserts. And we could then see, for example, how people's shopping patterns change as a result of this. So we could see how their weight adjusts. Those are examples of kind of endogenous results of changes in the environment. So those are produced automatically by the model in response to the environment in which it's located. And if we were to impose changes in that environment, they would change as a result. The model tells us how many meals they've eaten or what type of meals they're eating tomorrow, etc. That comes about because of these rules. Most important one, though, being weight. Okay, so we like to divide. When we think about our model, we like to divide it into endogenous factors, exogenous, and then factors that are outside the bounds of the model. There's no shame in this. We just say we're going to park it. We'll revisit it as we learn. We might do some investigations that test just how much incorporating something might make a difference. But for now, we'll leave it out. Now, why would we include something endogenously versus exogenously, for example? Why would we include something? I realized not 3 months thence that I carried around within my head a set of rules of thumb for this. I carried around in my head some guidelines, which I was specifying to students, but which were incompletely explicated. And so I aspired to write them down last month, or elaborated some earlier things I had written parts of them. Okay, if you suspect that you can't adequately capture a key dynamic behavior over that you're interested in, that you really need to explain without this variable, if you can't account for certain patterns, you're convinced, okay, you really got to represent this to capture certain patterns. It's a good reason to add it in as endogenous either immediately or a little bit down the road as you add other things in. If you need to capture the effects of intervention, if you need to capture the effect of, for example, an intervention that operates through prices, say raised taxes for tobacco, or changes in marketing of sugar-sweetened beverages by restricting the degree to which they can be marketed to children. You need something in the model to capture the effects of that. You need something in the model that articulates with that, something that impacts in the model, so that you can ask what are the ripple-through effects, the sort of follow-through effects of that intervention. So, for example, this model we've been looking at, if I wanted to examine what if I had more supermarkets in the core area of Melbourne, we can look at that quite readily because there's decision-making based on supermarkets. What's the nearest supermarket? And people go to the nearest supermarket. So if you add a few more, and one of them happens to be nearer than previously, they'll take that into account. So there we have a necessary element to take into account. On the other hand, if you had in that model something about how I go running a lot when I'm in Australia. It's extraordinary. It's wonderful, and I got to hear the cries of magpies and see the cockatoos aflight. And one of the things that makes it so interesting is that these groups out at about 6 a.m. that are exercising outside. They actually have quite a number of individuals who go out and exercise as a group. And they have all sorts of types of activities they engage in. The point here is if we wanted in that model we built to examine the effects of greater physical activity in parks, we would need to think about, okay, how is a physical activity program going to impact the model? And we need to be thinking quite closely, okay, is it just going to affect, say, How much physical activity is affected on average by them being near a park? Or is it going to need to take into account their characteristics in a greater level of detail? So we need to capture the effects of interventions. That often forces us to think through what's in the model and how can what we want to represent the intervention is achieving impact what's in the model. Or if you're concerned about something that will be affected by an intervention, you want to know the outcomes for cost and quality of life of, improved screening for lung cancer. Well, okay, if you have costs there, you've got to have some pathways to calculate costs. Calculate costs based on the current states that they're in, the health states that they're in, maybe for the operations they have to undergo. You've got to have those pathways to be affected by the intervention to capture the outcomes that you're interested in. So if you really want to know an outcome of interest, it's got to be supported by the model. To capture it, then that's a good reason to capture it endogenously. So the model produces that as an outcome. If you're concerned about how something's associated with intervention group, for example, in health, we're often concerned about equity effects, transfer effects from one group to another. It's not merely enough that we improve the health of the population, but we want to make sure we don't disadvantage certain groups disproportionately while other groups benefit. And some of the interventions out there perversely have been found that provide resources to people, et cetera, such as internet-based resources on health. They help the people who are already advantaged and leave others quite behind in terms of their health status. It doesn't really help those who are most in need. So if you're interested in, how, for example, group presence in different urban versus rural is affected by an intervention, you probably need to represent something about urban and rural contexts in the model that factors into endogenous behavior, factors into the dynamics. If you're planning to compare the results of this model with empirical data, you want to compare it with some observables. You need something comparable from the model to produce to compare to this external observable, this empirical data you have. That's a good reason for having an outcome, an observable that's endogenous. The model will produce HbA1c levels over time, and we'll compare that to empirically measured HbA1c levels from comparable statistic for the real world population. Good example. We want to develop confidence in the model. We'd like to have the model have certain observables that can be directly scrutinized and compared with real world. And finally, and this is something Jeff has emphasized, I've learned much from Jeff in this and many other areas. And one of the things he emphasizes is the key role of stakeholder credibility. You've got to build a model that speaks to the stakeholder interests. And it's perhaps an irony of the situation, but there are times where you add some detail to get full buy-in from stakeholders. Jeff talks about GIS being something that catches stakeholder attention sometimes. And even if it's not a foremost goal to your model to look at geographic effects, sometimes it can just capture an understanding on the part of stakeholders that's very important for securing ongoing support for your project, and that can lend the model them a sense of confidence that they know where the model's coming from. So maintaining factors of endogenous can give us extra flexibility, sometimes in capturing effects of interventions or exogenous scenarios. We can translate it to other contexts. But greater endogeneity, greater capturing of things in the model, often requires more data and implementation work. So there's a trade-off there. And generally, we proceed to add endogeneity of things step by step, bit by bit, as we learn from the model. And sometimes things we thought would be in there eventually end up not being in there because we discovered along the way this other thing is just much more important or much more interesting for investigation or much more relevant for our stakeholders. So I talked about models varying between minimally endogenous and heavily endogenous. You will find a variety of dynamic models out there, and they will, and I'm talking about dynamic models, they will vary over the spectrum. You can have very detailed models over here in an endogenous, minimally endogenous context. Here, you have a focus on observables. The relationship between observables is hard-coded in some sort of statistical way. The impacts of interventions are hard-coded on the observables, and the interventions are generally reflected as acting immediately on the system. The model is sort of a calculator or bookkeeper. There's really no behavior being generated by the model other than sort of how one thing impacts the other in a sort of very straightforward way. On the other hand, heavily endogenous models focus on underlying causal pathways rather than just observe statistical relationships. Between observables, there's pathways represented, the observables results of the pathway, and interventions are their effects are mediated by an underlying pathway. And disparities and heterogeneity are often captured with just a few number of parameters, and there's some unifying theory. Let me give an example of each. We can of one that could be done in either way. So Anahita there, Anahita. Okay, so Anahita is in the general vicinity, the neighboring building, but is not currently present in the room. She's at work on what I would call a heavily endogenous model. Alan also worked on important parts of this model, and it will be presented to you as a case study if you're interested in seeing it. Here we have causal pathways associated with beta cell change over time, associated with glucose and insulin interactions, associated with actually both beta cell mass and their functions. We have observables, but they result from these pathways. So we have HbA1c levels produced by the model. We have, for example, diabetes. The occurrence of diabetes is driven by this underlying model of the physiology of the situation. Interventions affect this underlying model of the physiology in the form of intervening upon these underlying pathways physiologically in a way that, for example, leads to greater stability in terms of the glucose levels, or in a way that leads to faster diagnosis of dysglycemia that has been latent. Interventions may lessen, for example, the level of insulin resistance on the part of an individual. And that ripples through the system in terms of risk of developing diabetes and in terms of outcomes for a child. This is particularly focused in gestation. And heterogeneity between different people is captured largely by slight differences in parameters. By contrast, a minimally observable model here would focus on the occurrence of diabetes in the population. There'd be some hard-coded relationship on the impact of an intervention on outcomes in terms of lowered risk of gestational diabetes or lower risk of type 2 diabetes. It wouldn't work through the physiology. It would work more directly. They would affect immediately instead of needing to work through the physiology involved. And observables, like those linking weight, for example, and diabetes, wouldn't be mediated through the physiology, would rather directly impact the odds ratio or relative risk of developing diabetes given obesity, et cetera. So here, there'd be sort of direct relationship captured. And even in the age-based context, we can have that, and indeed, we considered a model like that. And in agent-based modeling, a lot of models that are in this sphere of minimally endogenous, you'll find in the microsimulation area. Microsimulation, as a technique, uses tools quite similar to agent-based modeling, but it tends towards models that are focused on observables and that involve less endogeneity. They involve less latent factors to try to explain things, and they operate more on relationships between observables. So I've given some examples here. I won't go through them exhaustively, but I've given them as slides to you for different subcontexts. For example, HIV spread. If we were considering a model to evaluate the effects of different interventions, we want to evaluate the use of condom use prevention, for example. We need to understand how it impacts HIV outcomes, we need to represent something about the differential transmission risk with or without condoms. Otherwise, we'd say, okay, people are using more condoms, so what? There's got to be some way the model captures that, some causal pathways that lead to condom use leading to less spread of infection. Or lower risk of transmission for coital act or what have you. Needle distribution, we want to evaluate that vis-a-vis these others. We need to somehow capture the impact of needle variability on likelihood of sharing needles. If we want to distribute needles, clean needles, so that they're not reused, somehow there has to be a link. Okay, you have access to clean needles, that has to lower the needle sharing, and that has to ripple through to transmission risk in order to capture outcomes in terms of number of individuals with HIV. We wanted to promote the highly active antiretroviral therapy. We need to represent something about the outcomes of that to be plausible at all, the fact that that affects HIV progression and the risk of transmission. After all, we're probably a big motivation for this is it lowers risk of transmission, not merely stabilizes the progression of the individual suffering from HIV, but lowers risk of transmission. Okay, if we want to capture that in outcomes, there need to be the causal pathways to capture that. The fact that heart impacts transmission by lowering transmission has got to be in our causal pathways. And similarly, that it leads people to spend more time to progress less quickly to the AIDS state and remain more time in the chronic state. We presumably have to have a model that captures whether or not someone's diagnosed, so that individuals in the acute phase of HIV might often go undiagnosed and therefore they're not eligible for this. We need to capture something about diagnosis so that in the model, administration of heart is linked to a diagnosed individual. So this is an example of some implications of interventions on this. Smoking models. Young Chen, is she in the room? She sits at the back. Young Chen is responsible for a very nice evolving model associated with cigarettes and e-cigarettes and their interaction in the population. Quite interesting and contentious area within policy discourse. But when we think of representing factors involving, say, uptake, there are a set of issues that she had to grapple with, and indeed many models of smoking have to grapple with. To what degree do we want to hard code uptake rates by age? Say that someone at this age has a certain hazard rate of starting to smoke per year. To what degree do we want that uptake rate to depend on the prevalence of smoking in their peer group, to reflect the fact that if I'm in a peer group where lots of my peers smoke, maybe I'm more likely to initiate smoking myself? Is that an effect we want to capture? Because it could have a very material bearing on disparities in different groups in terms of prevalence of smoking. Or do we want to have uptake rate depend on sort of preferences, including preferences sensitive to peer pressure, but also to things like economic concerns, the price of cigarettes, etc. Do we want to have, do we need to have social networks to capture these things? These are different levels of representation. And indeed, for some models, we want to think about, do we even represent smoking at the level of an occurrence of smoking, or is it enough to just say this person is a smoker? Do we need to represent how heavily they smoke? These are questions about model boundary. And depending on your research question, if it involves consumption of cigarettes and in a heavy way, you might want to represent heaviness of smoking, number of pack years an individual has smoked. On the other hand, if you're dealing mostly with uptake and initiation, maybe that's not as central and you gloss over that detail. So these are some comments on conceptualization. I want to hit on a couple more of these things. One thing is that I had this model boundary. Okay, this was actually largely that presentation. It has a few additional features in it, and I want to highlight a few things here because they may be useful to you in your work. One is when I talk about causal pathways. I'm not sure how many people in the room have a feel for what I'm talking about. I have a sense that some quarters in health science, causal pathways are a familiar notion because you're talking about biologic pathways associated with certain phenomena. In other quarters, the focus seems almost all focused on associational relationships. To what degree is like a move to a mixed income neighborhood associated with obesity change? To what degree is a move to a mixed income neighborhood among teenage girls associated with change in the rate of pro-criminal involvement? When students come from a predominantly associational background and they're used to, logistic regression or some generalized linear methods being used, I find that sometimes this notion of pathways is confusing. And I want to talk about it for that reason, because it's actually central to what we're doing with these models. We're articulating at an operational level relevant pathways of effect. So if we think about a move to a mixed income neighborhood, we think about obesity as an outcome. There may be some association between this. The Moving to Opportunity study in the US, as I recall, move to a mixed income neighborhood was associated with a statistically significant decrease in obesity amongst teenage girls. Amongst teenage boys, it was not statistically significant. We could think about that association, but with dynamic modeling, there's a different type of thinking that's called for. And that thinking centers, ladies and gentlemen, on causal pathways and mechanisms. And I've used what's called a causal loop diagram from system dynamics to illustrate this. If we have a link between A and B here, variable A and variable B, if that link is associated with a positive polarity, it means if we increase A, so the arrows from A to B, in this case, move to mixed income neighborhood to recreational space, we increase A, all other things being equal, it leads to an increase in B compared to the value it otherwise would have had. So if we have a move to a mixed income neighborhood occur, in a family, recreational space goes up as a result compared to what it otherwise would have been, all other things being equal. If you have a negative link, say from neighborhood walkability to sedentary behavior, what this is positing is that as A goes up, B will tend to decrease compared to the value it otherwise would have had, all other things being equal. So neighborhood walkability goes up, sedentary behavior tends to go down compared to the value it otherwise would have had, all other things being equal. So a diagram that's shown like this is called the causal loop diagram. Often it features causal loops, and we'll talk about that some in our discussion of system dynamics. But what I'm actually trying to draw your attention to here is more basic than that. It has to do with this notion of a causal network, where there are certain pathways to effect. So if we think about obesity level, we think about a given change in obesity levels, there are several pathways by which this change might have been achieved, might have been secured. One is through a greater feeling of perceived safety, an increase in moderate vigorous physical activity, which tends to lower BMI, and that in turn, a lowered BMI means a lowered obesity level. The BMI goes down because this is a plus connection. Obesity changes in the same direction. BMI went up, obesity would go up. BMI goes down, obesity goes down, compared to the value it otherwise would have had, all other things being equal. So that's one causal pathway to effect. It's through a perception of greater safety because of the move to the mixed income neighborhood. Another way would be through positing recreational space availability increases. It leads to higher levels of moderate to vigorous physical activity, lowers obesity and thereby lowers BMI and thereby obesity, right? Do you appreciate that those could be two different hypotheses, but by which, for example, we could try to explain a change in obesity? Those are two different, we call them pathways to effect. But you'll notice here there's more than those two. There's neighborhood walkability and its direct impact on sedentary behavior, not merely on moderate to vigorous physical activity. There's changes in the fact that, for example, a move to a mixed income neighborhood might have changed the strength of friendship networks for teenage girls, for example, outside the home, and that affects their time spent at home versus outside. Perhaps they spend more time at home, and because of spending time at home, they're eating mom's good cooking rather than being out at the McDonald's. It leads to a change in their healthiness of their diet, which changes their BMI levels lower, and the healthiness of diet going up lowers their BMI and lowers their obesity levels. That would be another posited set of causal pathways that some researchers have suggested that might be a dominant one. We might also have posit that the greater availability of healthy food, the fact that we're not living in a food desert, means food is more widely available. It leads to a higher healthiness of diet, which changes BMI and lowers obesity levels. These are different causal pathways. And I don't want to get caught up in this particular example, but the point is when we're thinking or positing a dynamic hypothesis about the world, we're advancing a certain idea that might be an adequate characterization of how causality works in the world. We need to be thinking in terms of pathways, not associations. It won't be sufficient to simply say, well, move to the mixed income neighborhood is not associated, for example, with a change in obesity levels for teenage boys that's significant. We want to be thinking about, okay, how does that change come about? Because our simulation model will deal with some of these factors that are mediating this linkage. To capture this outcome in a simulation model, we won't simply typically specify this move changes obesity directly. We will be wanting to ask about why, and then we'll have something to do perhaps with the perceived safety and representing something about the recreational space available and about walkability. Just as in our model, when we tried to ask what would be the impact of a supermarket, it was mediated through preferences and distances and availabilities of parks. It's mediated through a network of different causal influences. With a model such as this causal loop diagram, or model map, as we call it, we can sort of sketch out our understanding of the relationship between different variables. A model map such as this is very convenient for highlighting sort of a hypothesis for how things might be connected together. Yes? Gabrielle?
When you're thinking about building an idea, so would you start, for example, by taking one of these pathways and testing it? And then the other thing I was thinking, so those positive and negative signs,
yes.
Do you want to put numbers on
yes.
this or test whether they're really positive?
Great question. I've been associated with eminent fellow faculty who have asked me, they say, oh, you have a causal diagram of this. That's great. Can you run that for us and produce the results? And I say, no way, hell, I can run this. There's just no way. It's not specific at the level enough to run. Because, as you say, there's a plus here, but how much? What's the strength of that connection? How soon? Is it S-shaped? Is it a linear connection between this and this? Without extra specificity, I can't run this model. So with model conceptualization, and mapping, we're first taking an understanding of factors relevant to our model at a mechanistic level, at a level of pathways. We're trying to articulate this, and we're trying to think a little bit more broadly about, okay, what things are relevant. And then, to actually take the step towards model formulation, we typically will carve out pieces of this. And at first, it'll be very small pieces. Before you run, you gotta walk. And before you walk, you gotta crawl. And so we're gonna carve out a very specific piece, and often we have a kind of hook. Okay, or if we're academics, we think about, okay, there's been no paper that really looked at this link between moves and simultaneously the impact on sedentary behavior and moderate vigorous physical activity associated with some change in neighborhood characteristics. So, for this paper, we'll look at that as our hook. We'll capture moderate vigorous physical activity and sedentary behavior for their contravailing sort of impacts on BMI. Or we'll consider healthy food availability in a geographic context, a little bit like this model. Ask how does it ripple through to these effects, and that will be the focus of our model initially. And we'll learn from that model. And we may discover things we wouldn't have expected. Chances are we may well. And in that case, we'll figure out, okay, what comes next? Do we want to further disambiguate this and change it to a further refinement of our hypothesis involving preferences for food and those evolving, or do we want to add another of these pathways? So often we sketch the set of causative mechanisms, these so-called mechanisms at first, and then we end up, for model formulation, we need to carve out a small sliver of this and cast it into a quantitative form where we can make defensible or at least a advanced plausible hypotheses about steps along the way in a way that can be scrutinized and that are quantitative, and compared to just the plus here. They're not inconsistent with this. This plus could describe it's an abstraction, it could describe a wide variety of particular connections, but to make this a runnable model, to be able to run it in any logic like that, we need to make that quite specific. We learn from that model, and then we might add in another pathway, for example, to this, or expand this pathway in additional ways we didn't at first anticipate because we learned something new. So here we're using this as kind of an initial model map to capture our thinking, and then we focus in on subparts of it and go into greater detail with them. Jeff, Kurt, so Community asked a question. Jeff and Kurt, I would welcome you to sort of contribute utterances after I answer Community's question. Community? Yes.
Is the model for certain individual or for given population?
Is a model, sorry?
Is the model for a certain individual or for a given population?
I couldn't have asked for a better setup for something that's coming up in just a few minutes. Causal diagrams came out of the system dynamics tradition. In system dynamics, models tend to be horizontal entities. So in the same model, we might have a representation of kind of dynamics within a typical individual. And at the same model, at the same level, in the same diagram, we might have some things about their environment, the availability of healthy parks or food in their environment. And we might even do so, in their neighborhood, and then have some variables related to the city as a whole. That's a sum of different neighborhoods. But all those variables are kind of next to each other. In system dynamics, traditionally, we don't have nesting. We don't have hierarchy in the model. And so causal diagrams coming out of that lack the ability to articulate really nicely these sort of hierarchies of context. Now, because I do so much agent-based and hybrid modeling in conjunction with system dynamics, and without prejudice, Jeff and I have further elaborated this form of modeling in some mechanisms that we believe speak to the agent-based context. and can allow modeling like this to be used in a hybrid context. And Peter, who sits to your right, is working on a tool that will be demonstrated within minutes that will allow us to put diagrams like this together that have additional features for a hybrid and agent-based modeling, and that can represent different contexts. So there may be a representation of a person and the factors related to them, and a service dog, which is another type of agent, and there's factors related to health of the service dog, and then some connection between them. Or maybe you have an agent within them, they have some dynamics associated with their weight and choices of foods, and then within their neighborhood, they have some issues having to do with the availability of green space and parks and fresh fruits and vegetables, etc. Do you see what I mean? So causal diagrams are wonderful because of their abbreviated character, or the very simple character. And I would recommend these in a heartbeat. But when we're put them in an agent-based context, often we need a little bit of sort of refinement of them. And if you're building a discrete event model, this might be something you think about a bit, but a lot of the time what you're thinking about there is what are the workflow pathways, or what are the steps of that, and what are the resources on which they depend. But the thing I want to get back to before the Krugerian and Macdonaldian utterances are the thing I want to emphasize here is all three of these traditions, system dynamics modeling, agent-based modeling, discrete event modeling, benefit from having a model map before you build a quantitative model. They benefit from kind of a broader thinking through what are the inventory of issues which I might be thinking about. And the exact form of that map is a little bit different. And I provided you, while you folks supped in the resplendent surrounds of the faculty club, your instructor worked. And I put together a document which rests even now on your online site, which is a little exercise to ask you to think through issues. And I make some suggestions for diagrams that would be responsive to each of the three traditions, for things you might want to put down in a model map. Jeff, you have the priority of age.
We find this idea, I mean, I just think of this as a collection of links. That's what a system is, or a collection of relationships. Links are slightly more general than relationships. And they're linked concepts. And we find, I guess, rather than a causal link diagram, it's basically either have linked objects, some of them can be nested. I think that gives a bit more kind of, gives an extra dimension to it. What we find useful is, particularly with stakeholders, is that we don't spend a lot of time worrying about the pluses and minuses. We just say, well, which links do you think are the most important? So there are two things we find. One is just getting everything out on the table, which people think are relevant to a problem area. And people feel that they've got their pet little thing on the table. Now, I like to say there's probably a PhD in every link. And you basically, when you build a model that generates behavior over time, a computational model, it may take the rest of your life to build that model. So that's this idea of getting stakeholder engagement. They find it easy, and again, we're a bit sort of free and easy about the way we just get this brained up on the table. That's probably all. Yeah, and I guess the other thing is that we often do a lot of quite thoughtful conceptualization of what people put on the table to really turn it into something really crisp that resonates with the problem at hand. And that can take quite a long time, and that needs, again, multiple iterations with stakeholders.
That's great. There's something that I've provided to you for those who are interested in it. There's some items I've provided to you on sort of team-based and stakeholder-based modeling. Modeling as a team or as a tool for teams and communities, and I'm really getting worried about whether all PDFs are there, because I see there's an imbalance in the count at the least. But I will certainly provide these, if not immediately, then I will try to do so before the day the sun has yet set. But there's some items in here that have further comments on it, and some aspects of this kind of group model building process that Jeff is talking about that may be of interest to individuals here. Kurt, did you want to sort of express anything?
I think you guys covered most of it. The thing that I can think about as sort of something that comes to my mind when I use causal diagrams is that there's definitely ways of using them that are much more rich than sort of the way I do. It comes from the system dynamics literature, so there's a lot of practical means of building that up, and you can look at it. The goal that we want to build when I'm building new models, I try to focus on what's a small question that is complex, and that's not always an easy thing to find, because you can always just add more complexity, right? So when I approach a problem, especially when there's a stakeholder involved who knows more about the area of research than I do, like a subject area expert, then the causal diagram is really helpful to identify what are the key areas of complexity. So I don't know if Nate, I wasn't around this morning, but I don't know if you showed that slide about the question, like the problem elements that are. Yeah. Okay.
They've seen it twice.
Yeah. So a lot of the times people come, in my experience, people come to the table with wanting to build an age-based model. They don't realize what parts of their question are so-called complex. It might be just hard to understand, but sometimes statistical methods work for those things. So the causal loop diagram is a nice way to be able to pull out, like, do we have feedbacks? Is there lack of understanding in sort of the causal interaction between things? Or is it just, I don't know the dynamics of this one link, and that's the thing I want to study. So sometimes the causal loop diagram can help focus the direction of your modeling venture. Not so much tell you what about your system you don't know, but what about your system you want your model to help you.
Great. That's much appreciated. And I realized that I didn't talk much about feedbacks and reciprocal causality because Curtis hit on it, and not least because actually in a version of this which I taught last month, or sort of a different configuration of many of these materials that I taught last month with Elizabeth Rue, which Kurt was also in. This notion of feedback was actually sort of the one singled out for being sort of particularly of something you want to think about with complex systems. Maybe I'll just mention a few examples, and once again there should be slides associated with this that are provided here, and there are these ones, Introduction to Causal Loop Diagramming in System Dynamics. And I'll just put these up because they are quite relevant for anyone wanting to use causal loop diagrams for mapping in what's coming up in a minute. These are some group model building sessions, and here's a session in Melbourne that I believe Jeff and Alan were at. Sorry? Canberra, sorry. Yes. How could I forget? With these causal loop diagrams, I provided here a set of particular feedbacks. There are factors that we'll often have that are causal pathways without feedbacks, but in system dynamics, particularly, but also when many agent-based practitioners are particularly interested in feedbacks because they have a huge impact on system outcomes, a huge impact on the dynamics of the system. And feedbacks are all around us. Many of them are stabilizing feedbacks. For example, the larger a queue builds up in the emergency department, the greater the likelihood a given patient who comes in will leave without being seen, which pushes back against the accumulations in the queue. People are going to be cautious about adding themselves to a line that takes 6 hours to draw down, and so there's a certain degree of pushback associated with it. We call a loop like this a balancing feedback or a negative feedback, because the original change, an increase in emergency department queue size, leads to a ripple through set of effects, such as changing the likelihood a person will leave, that pushes back against the direction of that inertial change. An increase in the emergency department queue size by 10 people will tend to lead to more people leaving and a slower tendency towards growth in the future. So we can characterize that in terms of a simple example like that. Hopefully each of us at a personal level seeks to make, if we make mistakes, we learn from our mistakes, and that lessens the likelihood we'll make those mistakes in the future. There's a learning loop associated with that. Or we have a perceived level of risk in the population, and compared to what we're comfortable with, it may exceed that, in which case we'll undertake measures to lessen that risk. Think about in the context of flu season, we learn that people around us have the flu, so we perceive a level of risk, we take extra care, maybe going out a bit less, or maybe making extra attention to our hygiene, and thereby try to lower our risk. So that's a balancing situation. We limit the risk, this initial increase in risk that we perceive through our actions. And we see these at a physiological or psychological level all the time. So we've done some work with infant and parent mental health, and here, an increase in infant distress leads to self-regulation on the part of the infant, which serves to lessen the degree of distress on the part of that infant. On the other hand, we can have a different so those types of feedbacks tend to be stabilizing. They tend to be balancing, bring a system back into an equilibrium, bring it back into balance. These sorts of loops, these negative loops, are responsible for, are present all throughout our physiology. So we have homeostasis because our body balances the amount of salt that it carries. It balances our fatigue level. It balances our hunger, our thirst. All these things are these regulatory processes. We get thirsty, we get a drink. We get hungry, we eat. We get tired, we sleep. There's tremendous numbers of these balancing loops, and not all those balancing is desirable. It can be the stuff of life, but at other times it's what traps a person into the cycle of poverty. It's what traps them in an addicted state where, the longer they go without a cigarette, the more craving they feel, and the more likely they are to have a cigarette, and it pushes back against that initial influence. So these sorts of negative feedbacks, these sorts of balancing feedbacks are sometimes desirable and sometimes not. Positive feedbacks are so called because a given change ripples around and amplifies that original change. So a person engages in smoking, they develop a level of addiction to nicotine, which increases the propensity for them to smoke again. Okay? So there's an addiction cycle associated with this that we term colloquially a vicious cycle. But not all those are perceived as vicious. I mean, some may be perceived as virtuous. So, we suppose we're engaged in social marketing for an anti-tobacco campaign, And the more visible our message is, the more likely to be shared, which further feeds into visibility. We want it to go viral. We want it to spread. So just because it's a positive feedback doesn't mean it's good in a normative sense or bad. It just means it tends to amplify itself. And this can lead to very, very rapid divergence, for good or for bad, in one way or the other. Negative feedbacks lead to stability. Positive feedbacks lead to very rapid change. So rapid that sometimes we have trouble responding to it, like an outbreak of an infection or the outbreak of vaccine hesitancy that prevents reaching herd immunity. Here we may have, or the spread of copycat suicide memes, for example. So here, for example, we might have infant distress leading to caregiver distress, think postpartum depression, or some other struggle on the part of the caregiver which worsens infant distress. Often typically we have these loops, not in isolation, but cobbled together into larger systems. And these loops compete for dominance. We'll have, for example, a balancing loop that may be due to health concerns that spurs an individual to try to cease smoking. But we may also have smoking leading to forming relationships with other smokers that further that, as well as through nicotine addiction. And when we're dealing with complex systems, often we have sort of these multiple loops balancing. As I noted, some can be desirable, some can be less desirable, and each is associated with a certain type of behavior. You'll find whole lectures by me on these topics online where I explicate this further, sometimes for different areas, for health, for that matter, for software development, etc. And we will often weave together diagrams that are larger that include a variety of factors. And I've given some examples here for more articulated diagrams that involve a number of factors of relevance to particular topics. And I provided some additional examples, for example, here related to poverty and substance abuse. Because diagrams like this may look straightforward, they may look obvious, they may look easy, but it's one of those things that's easier to look at than it is to actually do. And students often need help building these up. So a causal diagram is an effective tool, and as Jeff said, often we seek to put it into a nested context. Now Peter here, in the back, has been working with a tool to help us build these diagrams. And it looks like Peter has chosen this moment to step out, which is unfortunate. Yes, Scott.
I could say things about using causal diagrams in a discrete event context.
Oh, great. Yeah, that would be really good.
Basically, the short form is they don't use them. Mainly because discrete event simulation, so-called process-centric modeling, is actually, first of all, they're the least comfortable doing theory-driven models. They want data for everything. And the other point about it is that a lot of what you would do with causal diagrams and discrete simulation is baked into the method itself. We can talk about the theory. The theory behind this discrete simulation is queuing theory, as you'd expect, because it focuses on resource tree optimization. But the point is that it suffers a lot from the curse of knowledge and ignorance. Like, people know what they know, and they don't realize not everyone knows it. The sort of equivalent to doing causal diagrams, although you can do them, and I think people should do more of them for discrete simulation. The equivalent would be the process map that you're using to model. Everyone needs to agree on that, or perhaps a value stream map or something like that. But it's the process map itself that is considered the thing that the people care about. How do queues affect waiting time or the chance of queue about being seen? Most people actually believe that that's more or less obvious, even if it's not. So like I said, they have a big issue with curse of knowledge there. But so they don't generally use it, but there's a lot of not weird, but it's its own animal in a lot of different ways when it comes to this stuff. ABM and SysNAMs are much closer together in terms of how do you think about models than discrete event modeling is. But then there's other places where AVM and discrete are much closer than system dynamics. So there's all these different ideas. So.
Good. Thanks very much. That was helpful. Okay. Given the time, I think what we'll do is we'll have a 10-minute break. We're going to set up for a demonstration of a tool that we've been working on to allow construction of diagrams like causal loop diagrams for agent-based and hybrid models, which support some of these extra features of the modeling vocabulary. And we're going to demonstrate it. This will be an interactive demonstration, and you folks could follow along on your computers if you'd like to do so. I would also like to refer people to, in the guidelines for model conceptualization, I have put out a thing called model conceptualization exercises. And this document asks you to think through some questions about your model. And we ask people to try to complete this, if possible, by this afternoon, if not by tonight. It will provide us a better understanding. It will help you think through some issues. I'm going to ask you to take a brief look at it now, and I'm going to walk you through it after the demonstration of this tool, this CQHM tool. It should be in the portion called it's called under participant resources. There's one called support materials for model conceptualization. Do you see that? And there's something called model conceptualization exercises there. And this is the document of which I speak. Okay? Okay, very good. Okay, so we'll break for 10 minutes, and we'll be back for a bit of interactive demonstration, and then for some exercises. Okay, so Peter, do you want to come up here? Okay, so do you want to demonstrate off of your computer, or should we do it off of mine?
Judging by what we did yesterday, so
Yeah.
it looks like maybe the view on your computer, due to I don't know what reason exactly, is different. But on the screen yesterday, it looks fine, right?
Mhm.
So
Yeah.
I wonder if we can just give it a try right now.
Yeah. Okay. Okay. And then
Just click on that.
yeah.
Give it some time.
Okay. Yeah. Yep.
So you want to put it to full screen?
Yeah, I could do that. Yep. Okay.
The only problem is the rate. We'll have to look at here.
Okay. So sorry, I need to stop